The Case of Chawton House and the Grey Lady. It was a cold and crisp autumn day as the four trudged up the path toward the foreboding-looking estate. It didn't really look foreboding. In fact, it looked quite nice. But since they were there to investigate the rumours of a grey lady, the place took on an ominous and creepy feel. The building was a large, old-fashioned house made of light grey bricks and reddish-brown roof tiles. It was set out in a sort of L shape, so from the front it appeared quite narrow, and the left side had been partially hidden behind tall bushy fir trees. To the right a handful of fluffy white sheep was spread out on the gentle slope, quietly grazing. "Let's take a walk around, shall we, and check out the grounds," suggested Mr. Proctor. From the side of the house they could see that the building stretched quite far, and was bigger than it first appeared. "Look up there," pointed George. A pale face peered out at them from a second-floor window. As Mr. Proctor and the children all lifted their heads to see, the face broke into a grin and the lady began to wave at them. From where they stood the light was reflecting off the glass, so it was difficult to get a good look, but they could just make out the smiling face, a head of white hair, and one arm waving back and forth. "Look, it's the Grey Lady, and she's waving at us," said George as he waved back. Meg and Sam started to laugh as they waved too. Even Mr. Proctor struggled to hide a smile. Towards the back of the house was a small stone terrace with steps leading to the gardens. "I'll race you," said George as he set off without waiting for an answer. Meg was used to this, so she sprinted after him without a moment's hesitation. As they reached the steps, she shoved him with her shoulder and managed to take first place, as George went headlong into some plant beds. Sam laughed at his friends but didn't join in for fear of his dad's disapproval, and Mr. Proctor just turned the other way and pretended to look at something. He didn't want to embarrass his son by being too strict, but he did hope George hadn't broken anything that he'd have to pay for out of his librarian's salary. They followed the gravel path until they reached the entrance to the walled garden. The gardens were on the left through a large iron gate, and on the right were more clumps of trees that hid them from sight. The gate creaked loudly as they entered in single file. The frosted rose garden inside was bare, just rows of brown sticks poking out of the ground like skeletal arms. "Oh look," called Meg, "there's one still left." Meg stood in front of the last remaining rose. It was a little wilted and droopy, but still had plenty of colour. It was a pale orange, a shade or two lighter than a peach. Just a month or two ago this place would have been wall to wall with roses of all different types and colours. Beyond the walls they found a herb garden, which they all walked once around before returning to the house. Just past the terrace they found a door leading to the kitchen. "Let's go in this way," said Mr. Proctor, herding them inside. "You only want us to go in first in case we get told off for using the wrong door," said George accusingly. "You know, George, I really hadn't thought of that," said Ben Proctor, in mock seriousness. "I was more worried about finding myself face to face with the Grey Lady." Meg gave George an encouraging shove, and they found themselves standing in the kitchen. It was a long space with a huge wooden dining table down the middle. Presumably this is where the staff would have taken their meals. The table was sunken and dented in places through age and wear. A few smaller tables were dotted around for visitors, and one side of the kitchen had been modernised for preparing food and drinks. A very old book was displayed showing how herbs and plants were used for making medicine. "It's just as cold in here," said Sam. George pointed to a sign that said the heating was temporarily out of order. Just then a member of staff entered the kitchen with a smile. Her name badge read Olive. "Sorry to keep you waiting," she said politely. "Oh, no problem. The children were saying it was too cold to walk round to the front, so they slipped in the side door, I'm afraid, said Ben Proctor with a disapproving glance in their direction. George shook his head in disbelief, and Meg frowned. The children, she mumbled. Well, it's not much warmer in here at the moment, replied Olive. Can I get you any hot drinks? Why don't you guys go on ahead, said Mr. Proctor. I'm just going to get a coffee. Keen to look around, Sam, Meg and George slipped out of the kitchen and into a narrow corridor, while the voices from the kitchen trailed behind them, growing fainter the further they went. On the left was a small gift shop adjoining to the library. Through the gift shop was another short hallway to the front door and entrance hall. Their footsteps echoed on the wooden floor. The entrance hall was light and airy with very little furniture. On the right was a large soot-stained fireplace, cold and unused. On one corner of the fireplace a mark was etched into the wood. 2 lines overlapping another 2 lines. Look at this, said Meg. It's a witch's mark, said Sam. What's that? Asked George as he began to make the sign with his hands. First he put up 2 fingers in a V shape. Then he made a second V with his right hand and turned it on its side. He placed the second V over the first so that his fingertips were in the middle. People used to carve them into doorways and window frames, as well as fireplaces, to ward off evil spirits. It's supposed to stop them from entering the weak points of a building, explained Meg. That's right, said a lady appearing from a narrow staircase behind them. She had snow-white hair and wore a thin scarf over a smart-looking tweed jacket. They recognised her as the waver from the window. And do you know who this house belonged to? She asked. The children shook their heads. The land was originally purchased by the Knight family, who built the house in the late 16th century. When they ran out of heirs, the estate was inherited by Edward Austen, brother to the famous author Jane Austen. Although she spent a lot of her time here, she lived in the cottage at the end of the road, where she did most of her writing. Can you tell us anything about the Grey Lady? Asked Sam, getting down to business. Just then Ben Proctor walked in, clutching a hot cup of coffee, and exchanged smiles with the historian. So it's the ghost you've come to see? Well, I haven't seen her myself, but I have felt chills in certain areas of the house, and I have walked through a few cold spots. How can you tell with the heating off? Said George jokingly. Everywhere's cold. The historian gave a rather tight-lipped smile. Oh, trust me, you can tell the difference, she said ominously. One time I was alone in the long gallery. That's the hallway upstairs, the one at the back of the house. The air around me suddenly turned cold as if a draught had passed through. As I checked to see if any of the windows were open, the feeling went away. When I stepped back again, I felt that same icy blast, only this time I began to shiver. None of the windows were open, but I could see my own breath. That's when I got the feeling I was no longer alone. If I took a step in any direction, the cold went away. Has anyone actually seen the ghost? Asked Meg. Some visitors reported seeing a woman through there, she said, pointing back towards the gift shop. She was dressed all in grey with a pale complexion. They watched as she turned away from them and walked slowly into the library. When they followed, the room was empty. Does anybody know who she was? Asked Sam. We don't know. Perhaps she's one of the Knight family who once lived here, or maybe she worked here as a maid. Perhaps it's the ghost of Jane Austen herself. Sometimes at night you can hear the sound of pages turning, or whispering as if someone is reciting poetry. Some of the family have said they'd never spend another night here again, after being woken by the Grey Lady, roaming from room to room in the small hours. One family member awoke to find the Grey Lady crouched over them, as if searching for something. Their eyes met for a moment, and then she stood and left the room, disappearing through the closed door. Sam, Meg and George ascended the narrow steps leading to the dining room. The walls were panelled in a dark oak, and 12 chairs were seated around a long dining table with a large ornate candle holder in the centre. Portraits hung on the wall. Overall, the room was dark, and they all agreed it felt slightly ominous, as the faces of the paintings seemed to follow you. They left the dining room and trundled up the wooden staircase. On the left-hand wall of the landing was a large landscape painting of Chawton House as it looked in 1740. Unlike most of the paintings, this one was bright with a lot of colour. The sky was very blue with a low-hanging layer of white cloud. Cows grazed on a healthy-looking green field, and the buildings were white with red roofs. On the opposite side of the landing was a huge map of London spread across a folding screen. The next room was lined with glass display cases, showing documents and old photographs. When Meg was done looking around, she found the boys waiting for her around the corner. "Look in there," whispered Sam. "What is it?" she asked. "A headless figure," said George. Meg frowned and peeked around the doorway. For just a moment her blood froze as she saw an old-fashioned dress made of a shiny blue material and white lace, floating in the centre of the room. When she realised the dress was displayed on a headless dummy, she just rolled her eyes. The boys laughed as they followed her into the large oak room. On the right was a small alcove with an armchair and a view overlooking the drive. A sign said that this is where Jane Austen liked to sit and read. The house was very quiet, and again their footsteps echoed as they walked around the room, taking in all of the details. The next room they came to was a small bedroom. Halfway up the wall above a desk was a little door. It was the sort of door that would have given Sam nightmares. They guessed it was some sort of cupboard space, but it looked like a tiny front door built into the wall. Sam could imagine many sleepless nights thinking about the sort of creature that might live behind a door like that, and praying that when you closed your eyes the door wouldn't begin to creak open. Outside was the long gallery, a narrow corridor that connected to another staircase, and where the historian had felt the cold spot. Perhaps her words had spooked them, but the place did have a certain sadness about it. It felt like a neglected space that seemed to overlook the grounds, like a child stuck in a classroom, staring out on a sunny day. They each walked up and down, taking slow, exaggerated steps, and while it was cold, no one area seemed colder than another. Ben Proctor caught up with them as they descended the staircase, finding themselves back in the corridor leading to the kitchen and the gift shop. The last place to explore was the library itself. The historian unlocked the door and let them in. It was a square room with a writing desk on the left. Old leather-bound books lined the walls. While Meg was running her eyes along the spines, she felt and heard a breath on the back of her neck. She turned expecting to find George, but he was over by the desk. In fact, no one was standing behind her. She could have sworn she heard somebody breathing out. She shrugged it off as the historian came to stand beside her. "You may have noticed that many of the books here were written by women." "Why is that?" asked Meg. "Well, it wasn't easy being a writer in Jane's time. Boys and girls were given very different educations, as girls were expected to stay at home. Also, the publishing companies were run by men. Women had to use male pen names just to get their books published. That's why the collection here is focused on women writers. Despite the many obstacles, they proved that their words were just as important and helped to make the world a fairer place. I think that's why the Grey Lady is still here watching over us. She wants to remind us that when we don't give up on ourselves, we can achieve great things.